We will spend some time thinking about some different aspects of community living, including where someone might live, what kind of work they might do, and what they might do with their time when they're not working. So again, let's think about who are partners in this conversation about community living. So up until now, young adults in most cases have been living with family members or extended family members. And many of us are looking, as we look to the future, are thinking about where that young adult, as they get older and as their parents get older, might live and what they might do with their time. So school has been a very structured and nurturing environment, and it can sometimes be pretty terrifying for families to think about what comes next. And thinking about that has to do with many things, including what that young adult's interests are, what the family's capacity is to continue to support them as well as let them go. What kind of formal supports might be available? Are there waiting lists of 10 or 12 years for residential supports, or are there supports available now that can help that young adult think about where else they might want to live? So again, this is a conversation that can start when young adults are still in high school, and clearly the family and the young adult are at the center of that conversation. Aging and disability resource centers are a really good resource to begin to think about what kind of supports might be available depending on what that young person's and family's goals and interests are in next steps. We've talked about family care and partnership as two long-term support programs. They include what are called residential supports, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what those might look like. And then often this is a time where the county service coordinator, if a child is enrolled in the children's waivers, might be quite involved in helping families understand what might be on the other side of children's supports and the children's system. Independent living centers are a really good resource. Independent living centers are often staffed by adults with disabilities or youth with disabilities, and are places where families and young adults can find peers and role models for people with disabilities and what living in the community looks like and what working in the community looks like. So there are a network of 11 independent living centers around the state, and if you Google that, you can find the nearest independent living center to you and ask if they might, for example, be able to connect your young adult or you as a family member with someone who has a similar disability to get a picture of what that might look like. And then we've talked about some of these other resources as well. The conversation often with formal supports might begin with a question about what kinds of outcomes are you looking for. So, and families who have participated in the children's waivers may also have had a chance to participate in conversations that are less about what services do you want and really much more focused on what are your goals, what are your outcomes. And I think that outcome thinking can also be very helpful as you move into the planning process with IEPs. So for example, we become a little bit less concerned with minutia of skill acquisition and really want to start thinking, when my child or young adult walks out the door of this school, what are some of the most important things? So I shared the example of communication with you. That was one of the answers when I asked that question about my own son. He has got to be able to communicate or he's incredibly vulnerable. And how will he ever participate in a work environment if he has no form of communication? So I sort of stopped worrying about some of the little stuff and started focusing on these really bigger questions about what outcomes are important in his life and how do we start thinking about supports to get there, rather than specifically how much, for example, physical therapy does he need 3 times a week or whatever, and what is that little goal. It's really a time to start thinking about these big outcomes that we're looking for that lead to meaningful lives of participation and connection within communities. So outcomes thinking can be very helpful to begin to use at this time. And to use it as you think about, as we said, employment, where and with whom to live, and what kinds of other things, leisure, recreation, education, might be important in that young person's life. So let's talk a little bit about employment. And as I said, session 3 will focus almost exclusively on employment. So the purpose here is to share some of the language of the world of employment as it relates to people with disabilities and what some of the concepts are. So as you start thinking about employment, you're going to hear a different terminology. There are 2 sort of broad types of employment that are supported by our long-term support system. One is called integrated and competitive employment. And what this means is someone is working where other people in their community might work and earning wages similar to what other people in their community might be earning. It doesn't mean that the wages are high, but they are competitive wages, so at least minimum wage. The other type of employment that our long-term support system supports and that some school districts utilize is called sheltered employment. And some of the terms associated with that are that students would go to what's called a work center, work with a community rehab provider. Oftentimes they are based in one location, so the person would go to that location. They might not be earning a competitive wage, but what is called a sub-minimum wage, and might be doing work that does or doesn't reflect their interests. Oftentimes, sheltered employment focuses on what are called pre-vocational services that help the individual acquire skills that they would need in an integrated employment setting. Sheltered employment should be time limited, and there should be a plan that helps that person achieve the skills and move towards community-based integrated employment. Within integrated employment, some of the terminology you'll hear is this idea of competitive employment. So a young adult, for example, might need some level of support initially to find a job and be successful in that setting as they learn some of the skills. But those supports might be able to be pulled back, and they might be able to be more independent in that setting without intensive supports. They also might be able to get supports from people who work in that setting to help them, for example, get set up for the day or find out what they should be doing. So they would be participating in a competitive employment setting with some degree of support that could change over time depending on their skills. There's also something called supported employment, and this allows an individual to assist the person with a disability on an ongoing basis in that employment setting. So for example, if that person has a significant need for physical support or a significant need for personal cares or other types of medical supports in that work setting, then someone who provides supported employment services can do that. Those also can be intensive and pull back over time, or they can remain at a fairly high level of support depending what that individual's needs are. And then individuals can work in typical employment settings. They can also be self-employed. And there are a variety of vehicles to support self-employment. And I think one of the questions that was mentioned is around microboards. And in session 3, we're going to spend more time talking about some of the different ways in which individuals can be supported who want to be self-employed. That would include something like microboards. What's important to know is that you don't have to decide, I want integrated employment or sheltered employment. And you don't have to decide if the individual is going to be working full or part-time. All of these things can be integrated together so that if there are some very specific skills that might be supported with pre-vocational services, those can be provided. And at the same time, that young adult can be working in some community-based settings and exploring those as well. So I think one of the most important things to be thinking about when you think about employment is to, as much as possible, tie that exploration to what the young adult's interests are. And I'll give you another quick example. My son wanted to initially be a pilot. He has very significant physical disabilities. He wanted to be a pilot, and then he wanted to work on the tarmac at an airport doing mechanical things with airplanes. And so we didn't say, no, you can't do that. We said, let's explore what kinds of things people who work at airports do. And we eventually settled on information technology, so some type of computer support, which ended up he was fine with. So we kind of took the nugget of interest that he had related to airports and explored it in a way that he's now has a student internship working at an airport, but obviously doing something that also matches his skills and abilities. So working on the tarmac refueling airplanes just wasn't feasible for someone who uses a wheelchair. They wouldn't let him do it, and he couldn't. So anyway, so that's a way to sort of find the nuggets of interest and then see what kinds of careers or employment opportunities might fit that nugget of interest. So as you begin to think about employment, and here I would say the term integrated employment has become increasingly a preference within our long-term support system. So Wisconsin is in the middle of this sort of major shift in expectations around employment for people with disabilities. And I would say school districts are also in the middle of that shift. So as you think about who can support a discussion around supported employment, certainly the school is important, but there are other people that you can bring into that discussion. DVR is critical because DVR will help think about what kind of supports they can provide. And then if family care, the adult long-term support system, is available, family care and DVR together are important partners in funding a plan related to employment. Some of the experts that you might want to bring into the discussion are people who can help find employers who might be willing to employ that person with a disability. Many of our communities don't have a lot of experience employing people with disabilities, so a job developer is someone who can get out there, talk to employers, think about, is there a part of this job the person can do called job carving, and help create some of those opportunities. Job coaches help support that individual in the work setting to acquire some of the skills that they might need. And then who might be able to provide some of the personal assistance needed? It could be someone who already works in that environment or that setting. It might not have to be someone who comes from the long-term support system, for example. And then within all of this are conversations about how how flexible can the services that are needed be? And it may be that those services that are needed and supports are flexible enough through family care, but there's also something called self-directed services, which allows greater flexibility in customizing the kind of supports an individual might need. Something else to be aware of, and I know as a parent this was not something immediately evident to me, is that people with disabilities can earn income without losing public benefits. So this is a really important conversation to have. There are what are called disability benefit specialists who can help someone understand the interaction between earned income through employment and public benefits. Some of the, in addition to the disability benefit specialists, are what are called employment benefit specialists. So if you contact the Aging and Disability Resource Center in your county, they can help connect you to an employment benefit specialist. And then through Social Security, there's something called Ticket to Work and a number of different work incentive strategies that protect access to public benefits. And in most cases, we're talking about Medicaid. People need health insurance, and they need the comprehensive health insurance that comes with Medicaid. We don't want that to be a barrier to employment or, in a sense, to a life of poverty. So the two, there are now many things in place that allow people with disabilities to work, earn income, and maintain access to the health care that they need. So ask questions about how to get more information about these things. So let's talk a little bit about what community living looks like. Young adults are living with their families up until a certain age, and then what happens next? So many of our kids may live with their peers in their communities. They may get an apartment, share rent, share housing. They may live in another community. They may live in your neighborhood down the road. So find out what kind of living situation your young adult is interested in and what vision they have for what they might be doing. Would they be interested in living with somebody else? Are they thinking about living alone and what that might look like? There are a variety of supports for thinking about paying for where someone lives. So part of the SSI benefit can go towards housing or what's called room and board. So part of that check can go towards paying for rent. If 1, 2, or 3 young adults live together, which is not at all atypical for kids of that age, then they are pooling their resources to pay rent. Find out if they want a roommate or if they want to live alone. And, you know, if that young adult has, if there's not an ability for that young adult to move out, then are there other family members at some point in time that they might want to be living with, or that you as parents would envision them living with, and explore what that looks like. So I've certainly heard parents say, I can't imagine my child ever not living with me. And in some cases, and certainly part of that is cultural, part of it is you know, what that family's culture and history is, and part of it is economics and also what we can envision for the future of our kids without us. But certainly it's an important discussion to have and something to think about. Certainly as parents, we aren't going to be around forever. So no matter when this happens, it will likely happen at some point, and so we want to be thinking about what it looks like and understand also what might work for our young adults. There are different kinds of living situations. So you may have heard of group homes. More and more, similar to the movement around integrated employment, is this movement around called supported living. And it really thinks about what are the ways in which the person with a disability can live in the community with the greatest degree of choice and control over their lives in ways that other people in their community live and are together. So someone might live in a facility such as a nursing home, where lots of other people with similar needs live. But more and more there's an expectation that people can live in their own apartments, in their own homes, with roommates, and with supports that they need. So for example, if someone is living in their own apartment, you can hire an agency that might come in and provide support to that individual on an ongoing basis. That individual may have a roommate who is paid to provide some of those supports, as well as individuals who come in. So the living arrangements can look all different kinds of ways depending what that individual's needs are. But more and more we want to be asking the question, how do we normalize that as much as possible? How can it be as community-based and as integrated as everybody else who lives in the community, and expect that our formal long-term support systems will be able to respond to that question in a way that reflects full connection to the community. Other questions to be asking are, what are the informal or natural supports that also might be needed to support that individual, to help them live within the community? So if there are roommates living together, are there things that each provides for the others that might help them be more successful living in the community? And those may be unpaid supports. So how do you find a match that begins to put together community living in a way that that person can be supported in the most integrated way possible? And last, we want to talk a little bit about community participation. So we've talked about work, we've talked about where and with whom someone would live. What else are they going to do with their time? And some of this goes back to the beginning of our discussion tonight, where we talked about envisioning the future and knowing what that person's hopes and dreams are. So are there other things that they would like to be doing with their time? Not everybody can find a full-time job. Not everybody can tolerate a full-time job. But what other kinds of things might they be doing? Are they interested in volunteering at the library or the hospital or the local daycare? Many people find it rewarding and get a lot back from giving to the community. So finding ways to do that. Are there community organizations, clubs, interest groups that they might want to be part of? Think about things that they'd like to do for fun. Also think about health. So for example, is exercise important? Might they join a local health club? Or why, in order to get access to something they enjoy doing, like swimming or working out or music while exercise, or any of those kinds of things? Are there other types of community interests? And then how to foster friendships and social connections. And I think that this can be one of the hardest things to do, particularly if, as family members, you've been critical social connectors. So begin to think about, are there other ways or supports for those social connections that can come from the community at large? And always be thinking about the role of natural support. So for example, if there is a local travel group that meets once a month to share their travel experiences, might someone from that group be willing to pick up the individual with a disability and provide transportation to and from that event, rather than formal supports to do that? And then I think something for family members to always be thinking about and wrestling with is, what's our tolerance for risk? There's always risk as our young adults start to move away from the nurture and support of the family into the community. And our typically developing kids are always pushing back at us to seek out those opportunities with their peers and in our communities. Our kids with disabilities don't always have the chance to do that, and we as parents don't always have the chance to experience it. So our tolerance for risk may be different because our kids haven't been successful in those opportunities in the same way that our typically developing kids are. So I think just recognizing that this is a factor in our comfort zone with letting some of these things happen and delegating some of these things to other people and thinking about it and understanding what we're worried about, and at least to the extent possible, addressing some of those worries. So, again, we have resources that may be helpful in thinking about all of these things.